privilege to get to welcome none other than David McRaney to the stage. Let me try to spotlight David real quick.
Ooh.
Let's see. Boom. Here he is.
Spotlight.
This is David. You can wave to him. And the beautiful thing about Zoom is you can see David and David can see you.
I see you.
You don't know, David is a science journalist, and he's fascinated with brains and minds and culture. Back in 2009, he started a blog called You Are Not So Smart, which was all about understanding self-delusion, motivated reasoning, and he has pioneered a lot of fascinating research. He ended up writing a book, actually 3 books now. His most recent book, called How Minds Change, was released in June of this year. And he, most recently, after finishing How Minds Change, he has written and produced and recorded a 6-hour-long audio documentary exploring the history of the concept and the word genius, which is one of my favorite pet topics. So we got a lot to dive into today. The last thing I'll say about David before I hand it off, sorry, I'm just realizing you're just sitting there by yourself, so I'll join you.
Okay.
We're together. The last thing I'll say about David is I have had the incredible privilege of getting to know some amazing guests over the last, call it couple years. I've never had the situation where a prep conversation, David and I both, after, we're supposed to have like a 30-minute prep call. The call goes like 90 minutes. And I go, David, we should have been recording this. This was gold. But we just,
I was like, are we best friends now? Because it was so good. Like we both have the habit of like just talking endlessly about the thing that we're interested in at the moment. And then we're like, but that also reminds me of these 5 other things. You ever heard this thing? And we go, it was great. It was one of the best, like, it was the best prep call I've ever had, for sure.
Yeah. It's like, and what a shame we didn't record it. So I hope, dear masters of creativity, we can replicate something of the energy and the enthusiasm that we experienced in that first prep call. Who knows? But with that, what I want to do is I want to hand it over to David. And I'll just start with a question, which is, tell us about genius. Why is it a topic that you care about? Why should we care? And folks who are joining us, if you have questions, that's funny, Catherine, just pretend we aren't here. Yeah, exactly. We're just going to have like a public conversation right now. But folks, if you have questions about the topic of genius or anything that you're hearing David share, drop them in the chat as well. What we'll do is we'll have a little bit of a loose conversation around some of these really important topics for the first half, and then we'll take a look at the Q&A and kind of see what's coming through chat. So we want it to be a highly interactive and engaging session. And with that, I'm getting myself off stage. David, tell us about genius.
Okay, yeah, and feel free to interrupt me because I will just go on and on.
I will,
so
don't worry.
I wrote a book called How Minds Change, and I had so much like momentum from that, and I was waiting for all the things that have to happen when you do the back and forth before it goes out there into the world. And I took an email from a company called Himalaya. They were like a startup who wanted to get into that sort of Audible originals game of, it's not an audiobook, but it's going to be kind of like an audiobook, but it's also going to be kind of like a serial, like one of those long single topic podcasts that has a season that's just about one thing. And they asked if I had any like ideas for books laying around that I hadn't committed to. And I was like, oh yeah, I have this one thing that I cannot stop thinking about, which is, what does the word genius mean? And that was the whole pitch. That's my elevator pitch. And they're like, okay, tell us more. And I was like, well, like we throw that word around a lot these days. Like is Elon Musk a genius the same way Leonardo da Vinci is a genius, or like Beethoven, or and is it like IQ? Is that what we're talking about? And what about all the controversies around IQ? And then like, what is, like, I've met people that I'm like, that's a genius. And I do a lot of interviews for my podcast and for my books where I meet people. I'm like, wow, that's one of the most like fascinating human beings. And there is this feeling I get in the presence of someone extraordinary. And I kind of want to use that word sometimes, but I'm weird about throwing it around. I just want to know what it means. Like the modern, is there like a history of the idea? Is there a genealogy of the concept and all these things? And luckily for me, the person who was, I was having this conversation with, they had a little bit of the understanding of the etymology of the word. And they were told me like, are you familiar with the concept of demons and demonia and the nature of other realms, and how Socrates was considered to be a person who had contact with a separate realm of demonia, and that's where he got his ideas from. And they were weird about that because they're like, are you talking to a different dimension of beings, and that's how you're so smart? And I was like, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. So I was given the opportunity to go do this, and I just went on the road immediately. I wanted to talk about IQ for sure, but I wanted to kind of get into everything there is to do with this. And um, I contacted Mensa, and this is how this became the great one. This I love this so much. Like, and full disclosure, this will definitely be my next book, thanks to the fact that it was so much. I did so much adventuring for this. I contacted Mensa and said, "Hey, this is my idea that I have for this project, and here's a couple of things I know so far." And I would just like your help finding actual people who might be considered geniuses. We're going to use IQ as a measurement tool in one way, but we're going to bounce out of it. And do you have some people I could talk to? And they said, sure. Here's someone who is 100. This is a child who's 5 years old who has 155 IQ. Is one of the youngest members of Mensa. We just brought her in. You should talk to her. And here's this person, this person, this person. And they had all these. And I went to the separate Mensa groups all over the country and said, do you have someone in your group that, because they have a lot of like side groups, and they all said, oh yeah, here's someone who's a professional makeup artist for Industrial Light and Magic. Here's someone who's a flaming axe juggler. Here's a stand-up comedian. And I just reached out to all those people, set up times to meet with them, and flew around the world, spending a day or two with each of these people just to be in their worlds. And this is the way I work. Is I like the idea to emerge, like it reveals itself. I don't want to force any sort of hypothesis or any sort of conclusion. I want it to emerge and say, oh, this is what the story is actually about. And that changes over time, and it changes many times as you move forward. And I just started spending so much time with these people. I started thinking, I wrote about them as they all ended up being autodidact dilettantes who didn't like having a boss and were at play, and through luck or privilege had been given some opportunity to play at something a long time until they got very good at it. And then I eventually got to go to Mensa headquarters. I'm the first journalist, I say this, but it's a full flex in front of all of you. I'm the only journalist ever allowed to go there. And it's very much like, feels like you're walking around inside like Facebook headquarters. It's very super ultra modern and clean. And I met with them, and that was an incredible experience, because at that point I had spent time with a historian who took me through the entire history of the word, and the not just the etymology of the word, but the genealogy of the idea that you're trying to describe, the placeholder that it serves. And I became very intimately familiar with eugenics, which turns out that's going to be a big part of the story, because eugenics is a big part of the story of what happened when we started measuring human beings. And Mensa has a dark history of things that have to do with that, right? So I brought that to their attention, and we did all that. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is just sort of an overview. But I'm very happy that this is a Stanford thing, because my real entry point into this, the reason, the answer to your question of why did I want to do this was, here are the couple of inciting moments. One, I love Richard Feynman, and he famously has a very multi-tested IQ of 125, which would not put him in the genius category if you were going by the old measurement of you have to have a 135 or 140 IQ or above to be in the genius class. So that I looked into all of the people who are Nobel Prize winners, and most of them have an average or slightly above average IQ. No, there's very rarely are there people with the 135 and a higher IQ. So that is a question right off the bat. Like, okay, Nobel Prize winners don't tend to be what we would have in the old classification considered measured by IQ geniuses. And that led me to Terman's termite study, which is something that I could talk about for 6 hours, because that's
a Stanford study, right? I mean, or
1921 at Stanford. There's a long history as to how we got there, which involves bone relics. People used to collect the bones, skulls, and fingers and hair of people who were very famous. And when they started measuring those things, they couldn't seem to figure out what's the correlation between a person's head size and their how much they've done in life and how famous they are. And eventually, through the study of averages, we got to the early versions of the IQ test, and we got the IQ test. And then we get Lewis Terman, who there was this whole thing, thanks to eugenics being really hot at the time, trying to encourage smart people to have more babies and not so smart people to have no babies, which was a huge thing for way too long. He wanted to do a study of, can we find geniuses in the making? Like, can we identify kids who are going to be geniuses and then put all of our money, time, and attention on those kids? And so he took the IQ test, and he had to, he took it was 1,500 students in California. He made sure that he only picked people who had 140 IQ or above. Anyone else was excluded. And he also asked teachers to help him identify it. So they had to be good natured, which already introduces a terrible variable to this whole thing. And it's the longest running study in psychology. It's they followed these kids all the way up into their 80s. He followed them all the way until his death. And there's been more than 1,000 research papers based off of it, about 20 books written about it. But the thing that made me go, okay, I have an idea here for something that could be a really great project, is that none of them did anything of note, which is, problematic, but that was their wording of the thing. They didn't find any geniuses. It made him very sad. And he basically said, okay, I don't know how much IQ correlates with this, but the thing that fascinated me was 2 of the kids who were excluded from the study because they didn't have high enough IQ went on to independently win the Nobel Prize in physics, not working with each other. William Shockley and Louis Alvarez, one for the transistor and the other for particle physics, and one at MIT and one at Bell Labs. And what does that say? So that presents the big question, right? Like, what do we mean when we use that word? And is this mad pursuit for about 100 years of trying to quantify it, predict it, and use IQ or some other quantifiable measure to find the geniuses of the world led me to all these fascinating people who have a different track in psychology and other sciences for measuring human potential. And I started to really see a picture emerge of the people who have done incredible things in this world are people who have somehow, through privilege or luck or happenstance, escaped some sort of oppression or suppression of their potential. And it all ties back to where the word came from. And the word genius, if you're not familiar with this, you mind me tell you the story very quickly?
No, I think it's fascinating.
Okay.
I think it's fascinating. And I would just say, like, one of the things some people are asking in chat too is we want to draw the connection to how minds change or how they don't, right? So
we can talk about that too. That's been 6 years of my life before this.
Happening here. This is like watching Memento. It's the story in reverse.
No, I could talk about that at length as well. Because that project took me all over the world too, from Westboro Baptist Church to the Flat Earthers and so on. And as you can see, I like to do this work. I like to go into the literature and talk to experts, but I like to also do things in person and see it firsthand and bring those stories forward. Here's genius, and we'll table it after this so we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. We get that word from the Romans, from Latin, of course, but the Romans had this concept of the genii, which was these were attending deities that sort of like a guardian angelish type deities who pulled you into the world of the living from across the veil of the ether. And on your birth, a very specific genii would be your personal genius, your own personal genius. And they would grant you, as they're bringing you into the world, your personality and your unique talents and your you-ness, what made you you. And that was what they called your genius. That's how the word was being used. And the roots of this are, genere or genere, so that's generate and genitalia, any words that mean to bring into the world. And they did this little ceremony every year. On the day of their birth, they would sing a little hymn to their personal genius, and they would bake a little confection and sacrifice it to their attending deity. And that's the origin of the birthday party. Is that the best thing in the ever? It's so great to me that I did not know this until doing this project. The origin of the birthday party is the idea that your you-ness was your first gift, and that you have something that is specific to you that is considered your genius. And though that was sort of the original concept of what genius means, once we moved into the modern era of quantifying and classifying, in the very early days of psychology, where they were trying to create tests for educational purposes, for sorting people and labeling people and saying who is above average and below average and where should our money go, we sort of lost that thread. And I find it really fascinating that that whole time there are people like Spearman and others who were like, no, 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 let's not lose that thread, because I don't think this is a good idea to say you're a genius and you're an idiot. And they actually, these are all scientific terms: moron, idiot, imbecile. We're all right there next to genius on those scales. And by meeting people like Scott Barry Kaufman and David Krakauer at the Center for Complexity Science and others, there's a whole other wing about human potential that is very adamant about everyone has the same potential as, say, Richard Feynman, to find the thing that their U-ness allows them to, if they were given the opportunity to pursue it passionately and obsessively and with plenty of support around them, to find what they call a discontinuity in that domain. And that discontinuity is what we would refer to as a moment of genius or a work of genius. And then maybe we would actually call that person a genius. And so this whole project is all surrounding that concept. And I didn't expect this to be some sort of story about the human potential movement, or the new version of human potential, and how it all ties back into psychometrics and quantification and everything. But that's where it's gone to. And I just love tying it back to that original birthday party concept. And it's just bonkers and wonderful. And I love everything about it. And I will never blow out candles again without realizing that I'm part of this very old ritualistic tradition of saying, oh, I'm saying thanks for the divine spark within me that was granted by however you want to metaphorically imagine it today. It's still the same concept. And I find that really beautiful.
I love that. I love the notion of the spark. And to me, what's interesting, actually, David, not to like push too much on the connection, but just to play with it a little bit. You wrote a book about how systematically and how similarly we have cognitive bias, right? And how minds change, and you are not so smart. And then you also have this fascinating interest with how uniquely and dissimilarly we contribute our U-ness or our oneness to the world. Can you tell us about the other side? So genius is all about your U-ness or your oneness, uniqueness, I mean. Tell us about some of the most common blockages to genius.
Sure.
Either by way of cognitive bias or other.
And you could tell, you can see my arc as a person and as a profession by seeing that, oh, now he wants to talk about genius because he spent all those years talking about you are not so smart. And then in the middle, how minds change. Like, okay, yeah, because how minds change is me actually documenting my own shift in thinking and perspective on a lot of the things that I've been covering for so long. And within that is the explanation of how minds do and don't change and why they resist it, and persuasion and all those things. But yeah, I spent You're Not So Smart as a blog was 12, 13 years ago when I started it. And I was in that first wave of thinking fast and slow and predictably irrational, that pop psychology, hey, look how dumb we are movement, which is all based off of the research into cognitive biases, logical fallacies, heuristics, issues with probability, cognitive reflection, those sorts of things. All that stuff's still true. It's just that it's much more complex than I think we all originally presented it to everyone, because most of that research was done on individuals in isolation, and very rarely were those problems given to people where they could take the issue they were being studied, that was being studied, and then they could crosstalk with other human beings or look at problems in groups and everything. But that being said, we do know human beings are subject to roughly 230 cognitive biases. A lot of them kind of fall into categories, and there's kind of the same bias, but in different flavors of that same bias. Easily the foundational one for all of us is going to be, can we do a little game? Because that's something I can do. I can do this because I can all see you. I'm going to try to do this from memory. This is something from Peter Wason, the father of the psychology of reasoning. So among the people that I can see here in the chat, I'm going to play a little game with you, okay, to demonstrate one of my favorite ones. I'm going to try to come up with 3 numbers out of all the numbers in the universe. And all you have to do is, when you think you have figured out my secret rule that I'm using to pick out numbers, just lower your hand. So the way this starts is everybody raises their hand. And when you think you have figured out my rule, you lower your hand. That's how I know we're all in the same spot. Okay. So step 1, raise your hand so I can see it in the chat. Okay. And then number 2, I'm going to give you 3 numbers and tell me when you think you have figured out my rule by lowering your hand. Here we go. Using my special secret rule, 2, 4, 6. All right. Lower your hand if you think you've figured out the rule. Most people have figured out pretty quickly. Okay. I'll do some more. 6, 8, 10. That's pretty much everybody. 10, 12, 14. All right, just a few subversive elements who were like, I'm still going to wait for some more numbers. That's fine. Okay, so now to demonstrate to me that you have figured out the rule, I'm going to ask you to pick out 3 numbers using that rule. And I'm going to pick somebody who's on my screen right now, and I'm going to do the thing that you absolutely don't want me to do and ask you to speak. So the person that looked most uncomfortable was Julie Rogers. Julie Rogers, if you could turn on your microphone, could you give me 3 numbers that use my rule?
22, 24, 26.
Fantastic. Yes, those 3 numbers use my rule. You're fantastic and amazing and super intelligent, and thank you for participating. You can remute if you'd like. Okay, so let me give you some more numbers that use my rule. 1, 2, 3, 500, 757, 10,000, 1 million, 1 billion, 627 trillion. Okay, that's because the rule is any 3 numbers, one bigger than the last. But if you had assumed that my rule was 3 even numbers in a row, and you had picked out 3 even numbers in a row, since those are also one number larger than the last, you would have gotten confirmation of your hypothesis. And you may not have decided to pursue any more information because you feel like, oh, I got the rule figured out. And that is because we tend to prefer to try to make sense of the world through a confirmation bias. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that from memory. That's confirmation bias, right? So that's the fundamental cognitive bias that is the foundation of so many other things, which is and that's why we had to invent science, right? Science is trying to make sense of the world through disconfirmation, because we could have, instead of saying, and I know I led you into that, so I'm not saying that this is, I apologize, Julie. I'm not trying to say that I totally led you into saying something like you did. But to be fair, if it's any consolation, Peter Wason would do that to people, and I do that in front of audiences often. And I once did that at Harvard for neuroscientists, and they all did the exact same thing we did here. So it's just a human thing that humans do. That's why we had to create this framework of the scientific method and all the variations of it, because when we see something that's ambiguous or uncertain in nature, and we have a hypothesis as to why it is, our inclination is to go search for confirmation of our hypothesis. And once we have confirmation of it, we stop looking. And there's a very unsexy word and term in psychology. Psychology has all these great terms like reactance and pluralistic ignorance. But in this case, it's called the makes sense stopping rule, which is like the silliest label for anything in psychology, because when it makes sense, you stop looking for more information. The problem is it's very easy to make sense of things. It's very easy to disambiguate the ambiguous and arrive at certainty through an interpretation that seems like you've confirmed your hypothesis, right? And that shouldn't be an issue. It's adaptive in many situations. You can imagine you're in a tent in the woods and you hear a scary sound, and you're like, it could be a bear. And I have a negative affect in my body, which is causing an anxiety response. And I want to confirm that my anxiety is justified before I tell other people about it. So I'm going to take out a flashlight. I'm going to look around to see if there's something in the woods driven by this desire to confirm my hypothesis. And that's great, right? And the only problem is people who have anxieties or prejudices or fears or weird suspicions about the world now can take that to Google and to Reddit and to the internet and to QAnon chat rooms, and they can confirm their anxiety is justified quite easily, and gets them into a lot of trouble, gets us all into a lot of trouble. That's why the value of the scientific method is, what if I tried to, if I create a hypothesis, what if I work to disconfirm it? What if I look for the null hypothesis at the same time? Which we could have done in that little game. Any of us could have said, okay, how about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and if I tried to disconfirm my assumption, you will actually arrive at the answer. So that's one. Jeremy, I can do 25 more of these if you like, but that's my favorite.
I thought you said there were 230.
We've got time. We can go through them all.
No, I think, what's fascinating about that is how, while on the one hand, our genius is what is unique about us, on the other hand, we have this danger of falling into very predictable challenges. Are there, to go meta for a moment, David, are there predictable challenges that face one's you-ness? Meaning, if what makes us, if what constitutes our genius contribution in the world is our uniqueness, are there cognitive biases that prevent us or block us from manifesting that genius.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, many of them are at the level of group selection. That's where things get wonky because we're so driven by reputation and management and status. We're social primates, right? And as social primates, we really, really care what other people think about us. And these very simple problems of probability and logic that we fall into, those are manageable. We create sort of pilot's checklists for those things and say, am I doing that or am I not doing that? Where we really get into what really suppresses and oppresses us, our potential, is when we start slipping into labeling and sorting ourselves and moving into groups and getting trapped in in-group versus out-group competition, often called like tribal psychology, things like that. We are ultra social primates, and the great scientist Henri Tajfel, he demonstrated this with the minimal group paradigm. I don't know if you are familiar with this, but this was one of the most replicable and replicated things in psychology, where he wondered how it is that people can group up and commit things like genocide, how people could group up and hate, prejudice, racism, sexism, classism. He didn't like the explanations at the time. The explanations at the time of his research all pointed to very charismatic, sort of cult leader-like people were the root cause of all this. And he didn't think that was so. He thought it was probably more bottom up. And he had this idea, he was going to take people and put them into a study, and he was going to take away everything that would identify them as a particular, anything that would make them seem like they had something in common with somebody else in the group, until you got to whatever it was the minimal thing that a person would use to identify that they were like another person and they were separate from the other people in the group. And what he found was there was no such thing. There is no minimal group paradigm. We'll turn into this groupish behavior. We'll act in ways that are influenced by this groupishness of anything. And his famous example was he would show people a page of dots, and for like a second and a half, and then he'd say how many dots were on the screen, and then he just took your answer and threw it away, and he randomly sorted you and said that either you overestimated or you underestimated. And he told you were an underestimator or you're an overestimator. And then he would do these follow-up experiments where you had an opportunity to like give people rewards or money or make decisions where you could either favor people who were underestimators or not favor people who were overestimators or underestimators. And he found that whatever group you had just been randomly sorted into based off of how many dots you thought you saw on a screen would massively affect your behavior. You'd even do things like, if people in both groups could get a very high reward, like lots of money, or everybody would get a lot less money, but your group would get a little bit more, people would mostly go for that. It was very easy to get people into that frame of mind, that us versus them thinking. And I would say that if there's anything that limits human potential, it's escaping that us versus themness that we so easily slip into. And the modern sort of one of the things the internet has brought into our lives that we'll have to figure out over the next couple of generations is it's very easy to group up over just about anything. Yeah. And that once we're in groups, the psychology that affects us when we're in groups becomes much more motivating and much more driving of our behavior than whatever it is that got us into the group in the first place. The sociologist Brooke Harrington, I'll wrap this little bit of monologuing up with.
That's fascinating.
It's deeply unsettling, and I can't get over it. Like I've gone so far as to like listen to all the tapes of Jim Jones and just try to really understand this at the level of like, wow, this really affects human behavior more than I expected. I had this, like any modern Western, like weird person, as they say in psychology, I had assumed like I'm an individual, like I'm not affected in this way, but the fact that I feel that way is something that's affected by groupishness. Like it's a cultural norm to think of yourself as in an individualistic way. And you have this assumption, you've gone down into the bowels of your castle and looked at all your scrolls by candlelight, and you emerged from a staircase by yourself and said, this is how I feel about gun control, or whatever the issue is. But of course, you're deeply affected by your signaling and sanctioning and all the other things that we do. Brooke Harrington told me, she's an incredible sociologist, that if there was the E equals MC squared of social science, it would be the fear of social death is greater than the fear of physical death. And when it comes down to it, if you are given the choice between saving your reputation or saving your own flesh and blood, your body, your mortality, you'll choose the reputation. And there's plenty of research to support that. Like, it's like when the ship is going down, you'll put your reputation in the lifeboat and you'll let your body go to the bottom of the ocean. And we saw that with a lot of the COVID response. People gladly dying of COVID from not being vaccinated, or people gladly not wearing masks because their reputation was at stake to engage in that behavior. They'd rather die with their reputation than die in shame, and it's a big part of human reasoning.
I mean, this is so just the simple thought. Like, there was a mind blown moment for me when you go, individualism is a cultural construct, right?
Yes, right.
It's such a great paradox.
There's no way out. You can't get out. Like, it's an infinite recursion. You can't escape this game.
It's amazing.
It's like trying not to have a head.
Put your reputation in a lifeboat while you sink to the bottom. It's like, that's hysterical, right? It's so true. So someone asked a great question privately to me, and I hope they don't mind if I'll leave their name anonymous unless they'd like to say it. But I thought this was really fascinating. And I'm going to add a question to it, David, here. But they said, is there really such a thing as a unique program called me that's unique? How can we confirm that we're unique? And how
can we confirm it? That's great.
And I would
scientifically investigate.
I would just add to this person's question, how do I discover my you-ness?
This is great. That's what my next book is only about this, right? I'm gonna work alongside Scott Barry Kaufman a lot with this book, because I met with him when I was in New York recently, and I've bounced a lot of ideas off of him. I really like Scott's approach to. He's one of the last remaining positive like titans of positive humanistic psychology, in that old like Carl Rogers and Maslow kind of way. But a lot of that stuff was co-opted by business schools. The hierarchy of needs, like that whole pyramid thing, is like so completely unscientific, because it's a business school concept that was taken from psychology and then rendered into something that you could use to sell briefcases. Let's talk about your you-ness. Like, let me take one step into the philosophical spiritual woo world, because there's something from that I like a lot, which is this great Alan Watts metaphor of a river, and like in the river there's a stone, and there's a stone that causes a disturbance in the flow of the particles of the river, which causes a whirlpool. And that whirlpool is, if we want to think categorically, we could call it a thing. It is a thing, right? And it's but it's not really. I mean, we're being categorical thinkers. We're using some sort of human taxonomy to make it something that's not just another part of the river. It's really a phenomenon within the flow of the atoms and molecules and forces, that the river itself is just a categorical construction of the flow of the atoms and molecules of the things that are creating the river. And then you can zoom way out, you can zoom way in, you get very reductionist, you can get all the way out and start thinking in the patterns and arborations of everything from galaxies to tree roots and circulatory systems. But what I like about the idea of that whirlpool is, if you want to think of your you-ness as something like that, it starts to metaphorically make a lot of sense, at least it does to me, that you are just sort of this moment in time when the stochastic entropic forces of the universe are stable in this one little pocket, where these atoms and molecules are, for a period of time, not dispersing out and being part of the rest of the whole system. And that's your you-ness. Like, it makes you both one and it makes you both whole and separate, because it's all, in the end of the day, we're just applying human categorical thinking to something. And it's temporary. It's just a pattern. It's just a repeating stable pattern. And that's what you are. You're a repeating stable pattern of atoms and molecules that will be part of another pattern some other time. And just like mathematically, rules of large numbers and everything, we're all broadly the same thing. Yeah, we're all very similar broadly, but the more we zoom in, the more nuanced each person becomes. And yeah, a lot of the conversations you've had, a lot of the problems you've got, a lot of the life milestones you have, same as everybody else, but your very particular flavor of it is at some level absolutely never been repeated before. It's like a deck of cards. Every time you shuffle a deck of cards, that particular arrangement is like probably the first time they've ever been in that order, probabilistically speaking, which is very difficult to believe. I consider you much more complex than a deck of cards. So that's my very long-winded answer to that question. I hope I didn't get too weirdly outside the domain of quantifiable things.
No. So to me, that's a great general argument. I mean, a philosophical existential argument for uniqueness, writ large. How does one then go from, believing I'm unique, there's unus to me, to this is my unus? And maybe that's where, I don't know, just to posit, perhaps that's where the IQ test, and by the way, not on record, granted this is being recorded, I'm not saying an IQ test has value or something like that, but at least it helps some people understand some element of their uniqueness.
Yeah.
I wonder whether, all of the other elements or dimensions of unus, there's no measure, therefore there's no validation, therefore there's no understanding of it. And if your unus is not mathematical or problem oriented, like, an IQ measure of unus is, how does one discover unus in other domains? I mean, you give the example that Picasso is a different kind of brilliant from Einstein, who's a brilliant from Maya Angelou, right? And all that.
Sure.
Right? So how do you say, for me, given that there is uniqueness to me, how do I know what my uniqueness is?
The way I would frame this would be of the people that the whole history of people we've considered geniuses, and the whole history, and all the people that I met who are these extraordinary individuals in the spaces that I was able to hang out with them over the last year. All of them were just at play. All of them were. They were autodidacts, which we all are. They just had it was just very obvious among them. They were all dilettantes. They were doing things they didn't really understand at first, and they were at play. But they kept. There's a lot of privilege here. Like a lot of this family of humanity does not have the opportunity to ever become passionate or obsessed or be at play in any domain. Like it's tooth and nail still. Like there's a lot of anxiety and worry about what's the next day going to hold. Every once in a while, though, people have enough luck or privilege where they can just try a bunch of stuff, and if it doesn't seem to plug into who they are, if they don't seem to find like a yearning to return to it, if it doesn't feel like there's meaning here and I want to understand this more, if you don't find yourself passionate about something to the point that you're doing it without regard to what anyone else feels or thinks about it, and you don't even need to make an Instagram post of yourself learning how to play guitar or whatever it is you're doing, that given the opportunity to be at play and to get bored, like when a thing bores you, move on to the next thing, or when you feel like you've sort of explored a space to the point that there's nothing left there that seems interesting to you anymore, you've binged the TV show to the point that you don't care about it anymore, that like metaphorically for whatever it is you're interested in. If you keep doing that enough, something will create as Krakauer told me, it will raise, and I think this actually comes from Spearman's work, it will raise the temperature of your mind, which is a nice like old way of thinking about it. It's something you just like, it insists upon itself. You have to be part of it. And I spend a lot of time with, musicians and artists who like, when you are spending time with someone who's really in that place with like, I don't care what happens here. This is life for me. And we all have something like that. Like we all do. And it could be something very, very not to get into the left brain, right brain stuff, which is very pseudoscientific and not real. But the if you think in those terms of like something that's much more logical and stark and architectural and rule based, something more like like chess or something, it could be in that domain, or it could be something much more smushy and difficult to describe in anything outside of poetry, or it could be kinesthetic. It could be something physical. It could be something athletic. There are so many ways for this weird expression of nature and nurture that came out of natural selection, which is this unique human capacity for being able to disassemble systems and come up with discontinuities and just be human beings, this bizarre primate that can think and worry about things. We're all lumps of the ocean that got dumped out, and we're like, oh no, I'm sad, now what? There's a thing that you in particular could become obsessed with that you may not even be aware of right now. It's an unknown for you. And so what makes this more likely is we at the society level must create systems that allow people to have the opportunity to plug into those things. And once they have, we have to create some sort of mentoring and bootstrapping for people who have found those things at a young age. Even I'm advocating for dumping labels and going with this potential thing. And then as an individual, you need to whatever is limiting you from that right now. If it's outside your control, that's something we all have to work together to repair. But if it's within your control, just try everything. Get completely nerdy and weird about as much as you can until something lights the spark that's already inside you. That like the spark inside you ignites. This is a better way to, I think, frame that. And then pursue it endlessly until it bores you. And if it never bores you, that's the thing. And then it's not guaranteed that you're going to find a discontinuity in that place, but it's people who do are the ones that later on will write a Wikipedia article about that person. That's just some sort of selection bias. So don't get tied up in that. It doesn't matter if you go down in history of the thing you do. All that matters is that you do something so endlessly that you might take a sidetrack that no one's ever taken before. For you, at least, it'll be something that's you could not even have imagined it 5 years ago. This is a thing you're going to be doing. So that's my diatribe on that. And if you're wondering what a discontinuity is, I had to put a note out here because I was like, I could never wrap my mind around this fully without reading my note. A discontinuity is either an invention, a reduction, or a razor. This is an invention is a new way of making sense of something. A reduction is something that reduces the number of steps or calculations needed to do something that used to take a lot of effort. And a razor is something that allows you to shave off unnecessary steps. Now that's just all quantified ways of explaining, like finding something that's whatever domain you're in, there's an arc, and it seemed like there was just a stepwise nature of it, and somebody goes very far left, very far right, or very over here without having to go through another step. And that's what they consider discontinuity. And that can happen in any space. That could happen in baking, that could happen in downhill skiing, that can happen in quantum physics. It doesn't matter what it is. There's a discontinuity can emerge in those spaces.
You know, what's fascinating too is I go back to when Lord Kelvin, I think in 1900, declared kind of world economic, or the world kind of Congress of physics. There's nothing left for physics except more precise measurement, you know? And that was 5 years before Einstein's miracle year, right?
Right.
Which is to say, what is the word that you used, the word that you defined?
Discontinuities. That comes from the work of David Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity Science.
Yeah, so discontinuities may be more difficult to see with those who are entrenched, or those who hold the keys of conventional.
And Einstein's miracle year he didn't invent that was just math everybody had. Like what made him different is he got wild with his his brain teaser thought things, where he's like, hey, if I ran away from a clock at the speed of light, it wouldn't move, but would it really not move? Like this bong rip like dorm room ideas, right? But he was like, no, I'm going to try to work that out with math. And Krakauer said that there are all intelligent systems have inference, representation, and strategy. So inference would be making sense of things where there's missing information, but you can make sense of what the missing information must be. Representation is creating more and new and different abstractions to help understand something. It could be a picture, a graph, or it could be a story. And then strategy, like how do you determine a goal, and then how do you work toward that goal? Well, in Einstein's case, that was all representation. Like that was just a different abstraction of existing math. And by putting it into a different abstraction space, it was like, whoa, this is actually new.
Right.
And we've done that before. Like I like the story of like irrational numbers, which very simplified is they're like, I can't work out this problem. It would sure be easier if we made up some new numbers. That would, like, I can't, if we had a number that doesn't exist right here, this equation would make sense. Like
every high school calculus student.
Yeah.
Ever,
so they're like,
right?
So these mathematicians are like, well, nobody said we can't just make up numbers. How about a banana plus 3? And they did. And that eventually led to quantum science, that coming up with the rational numbers, which they just said threw the rules out. They said there never were rules. All of this is just made up gobbledygook in the first place. It just works. So I like that.
Okay, so David, I want you can take a pause from the screen for a moment if you want to look through the chat and see if there's anything that's
cool.
Because folks are asking some great questions. I want to hand it back over to David. Are there any questions or comments that you wanted to
I think we
cover?
actually accidentally answered the questions that are coming up. There is one about are geniuses made or are they born? Uh, you know that this obviously a question that comes around all the time in this domain, but it's also one that has generated all the problems because remember eugenics, bad thing that we did for way too long. Also, really blows my mind that Helen Keller was a strong eugenicist. That made me very sad to learn that. But everybody was. It was intellectuals of a certain time period. It was like the whole thing. And they had genes were just starting to be a thing. Hereditary is just starting to be a thing. And there was a movement of trying to like create some sort of bizarre genetic utopia, which has spiraled out in all of our science fiction ever since. Are they made or born? Well, it comes down to, is a genius a person, a process, or a product of a process? The answer, of course, in my thinking is yes. I think genius is just the word we use to describe being in the presence of the extraordinary. It's trying to articulate the ineffable at the end of the day, which is I like that there's the attempt by Krakauer to say when someone who is given the opportunity to pursue something passionately and obsessively arrives at a discontinuity, we will consider both the person, the process, and the product a genius. That's the word that we're using, which kind of goes back to the original thinking in some way. I also like the idea that genius is just simply your uniqueness, and if you allow your uniqueness to be expressed fully, then it's very likely you'll do something that will, if not create that discontinuity, will contribute to it eventually among everyone working on that same thing. But as far as like being born, the born part, I guess I'm answering my question. Like the born part is you already have this capacity just by being a human being. You have that capacity, and then how we as a society nurture that capacity and allow it to express not instead of smothering it, we give it not just a chance to breathe, but it can inspire. And like I'm using that from the roots of that word, like the etymology of it, to inspire and to inspire others. I think that's my weird answer to that. And then there are other questions about how minds change. I'm very happy to switch gears if you don't want to talk about that for a minute, but I could also jam out on all this forever. Part of the Genius Project, which I feel like I should have mentioned to everybody, was one of the best days of my entire life. Was I got to spend time with Juliette Leong. When I met her, she was 5 years old. Do you see this? I still have this. This used to be on my phone until the stickiness wore off. It's a little smushy sticker. She's stuck on my phone. I just want to say briefly how crazy that was. She was tested at 155 IQ. It's likely higher, and I wanted to spend time with someone who's so young and so fascinating to me. And I knocked on the door to their home in California, and her parents, Willa and I forget her dad's name all of a sudden, but they opened the door and they were like, "Hi, how you doing? This is Juliette," and bye. And they just left. And that was just like, "Oh, hey, I'm an adult man and you're a tiny little girl. Let's go. Hi, how are you? What's your life like?" And she's like, "Come with me." And we ran down the stairs into their basement, which was the size of the entire house. It was this huge, like lower room. And it was just a mad scientist laboratory, like a naturalist from the 1700s or something. It was like, there's experiments over here and she's making a robot over here, and there's an abacus, and then there's like drawings and paintings, and then she wanted to show me how she could play the violin. She played the violin for me, and then we went over and looked at her dinosaurs, and she was absolutely completely blown away that I had a little bit of dinosaur knowledge. So we like talked about dinosaurs for a little while. And then she challenged me to a math off, which I lost every round of. And she had a density experiment in the corner she wanted to show me. Also, this whole time she was wearing a butterfly costume. She had like flappy wings and she's running around. And she sang some songs. And then like when I went upstairs, she also played on the trampoline and she's raising chickens. So I got to go up there and look at all of her chickens. It was amazing, right? And but she had paintings all over the house that were incredible, and I didn't know who did them. I was like, "Oh, you seem to like this particular artist. Who did this?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, these are all Juliette's." I'm like, "What?" And like she was doing it at like 3, 4, and 5 years old, and it's odd things like lightning strikes and frozen ponds, and the way that they were like, I think maybe we have something going on here, was when she was a little kid, she drew her dad with a magic marker, and it just looks like her dad, like you could tell. And I was they had a video of her doing it, and it's crazy. She draws like la 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 la, la, and I'm like, I recognize that person. That's you. You're standing in front of me. That's incredible. And I'll tell you all this because one of the things that I felt like, oh wow, it's gonna be such a good story to tell people is that she had to go to summer camp, and they were like, hey, you want to break out some wine? I was like, absolutely. So we broke out the wine, and I'm just asking them about what it's like to raise a child like this. And they started talking like they were Clark Kent's parents, like they were Superman's parents. That's how they felt because they aren't academic. They feel like an alien landed in their lives, and they're having to do everything they can to create an environment to allow her to sort of figure herself out. That's why there's so many different experiments. And I felt like, oh wow, what if I can only imagine. My childhood was nothing like this. Like, I'm imagining a childhood that like this could be incredible, right? For all of us. So there's that part of the story. And then Willa asked me, do you believe in reincarnation? And we had that weird discussion for a second, which, I was like, no, but I'm fascinated why you're asking the question. And she did, this is my actual impression of that moment. She's like, well, Juliet, like, she was struggling to find some answer for how they could have had this child because they didn't feel worthy of her. And they felt that there must be some sort of supernatural explanation for her very existence. And it felt like the same sort of scrambling to articulate the ineffable that is part of that whole story of genius, of the whole original concept of like, this must be something from the other, from beyond. And I find that just absolutely beautiful and compelling. I just wanted to retell that story. It's one of my favorite parts of the whole thing.
It's wonderful to learn from you. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. And hopefully you got a little bit of a glimpse of the prep call that we had heading into this session. It was super fun to get to have you here, David. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for the work that you're doing.